Welcome back, folks. Kelly's Taboo Terrors presents Visceral Pleasure and Extreme Cinema 3. I love bringing all you folks together to discuss my favorite subgenre of film, and that's extreme cinema. And as you can tell, this has turned into an annual event. So if you'd like to get involved, please email us. It's horrorspinsters@gmail.com. I'm Kelly from the Spinsters of Horror, and my co-host Jessica and I have a monthly show called I Spit in Your Podcast, where we discuss cult, horror, and subversive cinema. I also co-host a gorecast on disturbing films with the queen of extreme, Zoba with a shotgun, called Our Bloody Obsession. I created Taboo Terrors probably maybe 4 years ago, because I found myself drifting more towards these intriguing, dark, disturbing, transgressive films. I just found that conventional horror just wasn't exciting me that much anymore. So once I dove into the abyss of the extreme, I've never looked back. So content and trigger warnings for everybody watching this. If you know anything about Kelly's Taboo Terrors, then I hope you know what you're getting into. But if not, your first time here, I will remind folks that there will be discussions on various themes and films that might be upsetting to some viewers, such as sexual assault, violence, torture, cannibalism, snuff, and more will be mentioned. So viewers' dismemberment is strongly advised. So this is panel 2 of my weekend of Visceral Pleasure and Extreme Cinema. And today's panel is on Extreme Essentials, the August Underground Trilogy. So with any film genre, there are the classics or those deemed essential to watch in order to gain knowledge of the genre's origins. There are differing opinions in the extreme horror world, about what is an essential film, but there are some movies that come up enough and time again that are deemed or claimed to be a must-see movie. The trilogy that my guest and I will be talking about today is considered the most disturbing franchise ever made, and you must see it to believe it. I am talking about August Underground from 2001, August Underground Mordum from 2003, and August Underground Penance from 2007. The August Underground Trilogy. Let's spread the sickness. So I'm going to announce and introduce my esteemed panel of guests, excellent guests. I want to welcome back Yagrain. So Yagrain is an Irish horror film critic, writer, and podcast host of What a Scream, with interest in Irish horror, parenthood and horror, as well as the possession genre. She is a senior contributor at both Moving Pictures Film Club and Ghouls Magazine, as well as bylines with Dread Central, Fangoria, Horrified Magazine, BFI Online, and Film in Dublin, as well as being published in the Hear Us Scream Voices of Horror Volume 2. Hey, Yagrain, thanks for coming back.
Hi, it's me. I'm back.
My next guest is Tori Potenza. So Tori is a writer, podcaster, critic, and horror historian. She works as the community and partnerships manager for Creator VC and is currently working on their 90s horror documentary. Do you remember In Search of Darkness, folks? We're coming up with the 90s. That's very exciting, Tori. She is a body horror and Cronenberg enthusiast who has been exploring sex and gender themes in his work for years. You can find their writing at Movie On, Certified Forgotten, Hear Us Scream, Slay Away With Us, among others. You'll also find her video essay work coming to MAI Feminism later this year. Hello, Tori.
Hi, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Thank you for coming. And then our third and final guest, I'm going to welcome back from last year, Lydia Peaver. So Lydia is a horror author and bookworm living in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Yay, Canada. Her debut novel, Night Face, was published in 2011 and short stories have appeared in Postscripts to Darkness, Dark Moon Digest, For When the Veil Drops, Memento Mori, The Wicked Library, and her collected series, Pray Lied Eve. In her spare time, she updates the new release section of the Horror Writers Association website, talks about horror films, and is the co-host of the Dead Air podcast, and dissects horror books on YouTube at Typical Books. Being a big fan of horror music, books, and film, anywhere there is blood, you will probably find her lurking in the corner. Welcome, Lydia. Hello, welcome back.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be back, really.
And I'm your host, Kelly. And I'm so glad to be here talking about some of my favorite extreme horror movies. It is what it is. They really are. They're kind of again, I do feel they are a must watch, and they're kind of like, there's like, probably, I don't want to talk about the iceberg, but there's layers of depravity that you can find in movies that, you might be able to reach this layer and then you can go a deeper layer. I should be going down to purgatory, but these movies are definitely top tier in my mind when it comes to extreme cinema. I'm wearing an August Underground Mordum t-shirt. I've got my Blu-ray here, limited run. I know Lydia's got some merch over there, some swag.
I do. I'll show it really quick.
Yes.
Back patch. And some of these items are probably like one of a kind. My husband,
Absolutely.
Chris, used to host and was the creator and the co-host of Bind Torture Cast podcast. And he's a huge fan of subversive extreme horror cinema and also lived in Pennsylvania. So I've got my Mordum cup ready to go.
I love this. All right, let's get down into our dark and dirty business today. So my first question for my guests here today, and I can't wait because this is a first time watch for a lot of you. So what was your first experience with the August Underground trilogy? And I'll start with you, Ukraine.
So this was my first experience watching it just for this panel. Since getting into extreme horror, like before I had a child, I was like, oh, I can't touch the gore. And then I had a child and I was like, you know what? I've seen it all. It's grand. So I started getting into extreme horror, and August Underground has always been that title that everyone's like, oh my God, have you watched this yet? And I've always been putting it off. And then you came out with the panel titles. And I was like, you know what? I'll just grab it by the balls and I'm just going to do it. So this was my first watch. And it was so funny. I was saying before we came on that my experience of it, I was sitting alone in the dark in my living room at my laptop watching it like some kind of naughty child. And my husband, who is the epitome of golden retriever vibes, came in and I had to scream at him to get out because I was like, no, you're too much of a sweet baby angel to see this. So yeah, that was my first experience of this trilogy.
And briefly, did you like them?
Can you say you like them? I think that's kind of like are you allowed to say you like them? I don't know. You know what? I wouldn't stand up and be like, I'm a fan, but I appreciate it for what it represents and what it is and what it's done for the extreme horror subgenre. So I will say that.
Excellent. Tori, what was your first experience with August Underground?
So yeah, my first experience was watching all three of these last Saturday, which...
Did you binge them? I said not to binge them.
I had things on in between to try to help out a little bit, but I also had the house to myself and I knew no one else wanted to watch them with me. So I was like, this is the day. Although I did order a pizza and could not touch it that day. But yeah, it was a wild experience. I mean, it obviously has a reputation for a reason, and I am a huge horror fan, and I think I'm a huge fan of most body horror, gross out kind of stuff, but I am realizing there is just a whole lot of extreme horror that is still really new to me, which is kind of exciting. And I thought, well, if I can watch these, I can probably watch anything. So that was kind of my goal.
Love that. And Lydia, first experience. I know it's varied.
Yeah, it is varied, and it stretches over almost the life of these movies. Because I do recall Fred Vogel, the Vogels, getting stopped at the Canadian border, unable to bring the movies here to a festival of fear for room morgue, and having money ready and not being able to buy them. And then I think me and maybe a lot of people in Canada thought they were banned here. So I just thought, well, I'll never see those movies. And then years later, someone watching August Underground, and it was among those friends of mine that watched a lot of extreme stuff, where I watched The First Guinea Pig, Some Faces of Death, things like that. And so sort of watched it with a half an eye because we were hanging out. And then I didn't watch all of Mordum. I watched clips and pieces of Mordum after Sandman came out, which I'm a huge fan of. We just rewatched yesterday and I love that film. So then it wasn't until yesterday that I ended up being able to watch Penance finally to complete the trilogy. But we did watch all 3 of them together. So we binged them, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. But we watched a couple, like watch it one day and then a few days and then the next one. So it was a really nice family time with my husband to watch these wonderful films together as a family.
And Penance is a Christmas movie, so Christmas horror movie.
Super. Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I think we'll have to watch it again over Christmas.
I might do that too. Okay, so now that you've seen this, you know, for so many of you for the first time, it is the August Underground trilogy is for sure an infamous series, not only in the horror world, extreme cinema world, but also in the world of film. Like they are pretty groundbreaking and well known. Like even a regular horror fan, like they're gonna know August Underground. Haven't seen it, but they're gonna know. It's just in the zeitgeist, right, of like horror film kind of history. So now that you've watched them, you've learned a bit more about them. So how about we discuss then their influence, if any, you think they have on the world of extreme horror? So I know you, Grain, earlier you said that you may or may not like them per se, but you appreciate and respect what they have brought to the world of extreme cinema. So why don't you start us off in discussing the August Underground trilogy's influence on film and extreme cinema?
Sure. I think there is this idea that especially in the advent of like what we now call torture porn, whereas, you know, it was kind of described as shock for shock's sake and, you know, torture for the sake of torture. And they were almost thought to be invalid in the world of cinema, because how can you just do a film that's just about torture and blood and gore? Whereas I think that the August Underground trilogy and its influence is kind of pushing back against that and saying, well, like, why not? Why isn't it valid? Why can I not be shocking and see how far I can push my audiences? And, you know, what limits do my audiences have? And for filmmakers to be able to test that, as well as testing themselves and be like, well, what can I show on screen? How realistic can I make it to the point of it being, you know, almost a snuff film? Is it going to cause the Charlie Sheens of the world to, you know, get in touch with the FBI? So I really think that it has this influence on filmmakers now to be like, you know what, not everything has to be deep and meaningful, even though there is subtext in August Underground, but it's more like it doesn't have to be. It can just be torture and shock for shock's sake, because even that says something about audiences and filmmakers.
Great point. Tori, again, this is a first-time watch. You're delving into the world of extreme cinema. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you made a couple of great points there as well. I mean, I also agree. I feel like I more appreciate these movies for what they are than like love or like these movies. But I also listened to the episode that you did on your other podcast, Our Bloody Obsession, because I really wanted to hear from the filmmaker. And I think that also helped me get a little bit more perspective, hearing like, oh, this is a person that seems actually very lovely in real life who made this. But I think thinking about too, just things like the VHS series and even just like a lot of like more found footage, grainy kind of like 90s style, I think that has come back in a big way. And so watching this reminded me a lot of that. And then also just thinking about, you know, listening to the interview you did, it was clear that a lot of it was about, you know, serial killers and the commentary of our obsession with serial killers. And I think that is still really prevalent today. It seems like more than ever, there's a huge problem with just true crime and how we talk about true crime and this weird, obsessive, almost like godlike status we hold some of these like truly awful people to. And so just putting that in your face of like, these are the kind of people that you are idolizing was, I think, a really interesting and impactful part of this for me.
Agreed. Lydia.
Yeah, hugely influenced, and it influences people in several different spheres. Like, I don't know if Atroz, the film by Lex Ortega, would exist the way that it does without August Underground as its grandfather. But then maybe he was just influenced by, of course, the news happening around him. much like Fred Vogel was, or other people's impression and the sociological impact of serial killers and killing and death, and maybe even law enforcement, which is the character that doesn't exist in this particular set of films.
Yep.
That does exist in Atroz, but then not wanting to glorify serial killers and wanting to show it as its gritty realism. Like, this is absolutely different from what's that? Hannibal, Hannibal Lecter. It's certainly not Dexter, right? But then again, were they not both maybe so much more with Atroz influenced by Blair Witch, something as benign as all that, like so many other filmmakers are. And then it became a lot more acceptable to film on video again and to put out these found footage films in sort of a rough and tumble manner. And it taught people a lot of things. And the two most important, probably, that the gore needs to look real, period, to be successful in this. And making the gore look real is a lot of hard work, like really hard work. And those are the things I appreciate the most about these films. And they probably help people set boundaries too, like filmmakers or fans of extreme film, because you got to learn like how other countries treated obscenity, like Canada and other countries that maybe balked at this sort of thing, and people who watch them, because there is that different set of like fans, right, that maybe shouldn't watch these, or they can't watch these, and then those who hold them as a holy grail.
I love that you brought up essentially like censorship and the boundaries of media and stuff, because I remember watching an interview with Fred Vogel during my research for the Our Bloody Obsession interview, but also Zoe and I's episode on the trilogy itself, that Fred Vogel, so Fangoria would not cover anything August Underground, but you know who would? Rue Morgue here in Canada, our Canadian kind of, our horror magazine here, like Fangoria. Rue Morgue's our Fangoria, and we absolutely were like, yes, yeah, we're going to cover this. I mean, that was definitely in the early aughts. They did do an American Guinea Pig kind of cover story recently, which I was really impressed and surprised by, because they kind of started to veer away from some of the more transgressive type of movies, except for The Sadness. They had a full like feature on it, but I love that. And I kind of want to jump ahead on a question I was going to ask later, but y'all kind of touched on it already, which is what I think is one of the main things that I very much enjoy about this trilogy, is the fact that Fred Vogel's like, one, we want to make the sickest movie that's been ever made. I think they did a pretty good job making some pretty sick movies. Absolutely. But he wanted his take on serial killers, because he's the same way. Fred Vogel, yes, is a sweetheart and is a very like unassuming man. But he's like, you know what? Serial killers are not to be idolized. They are not to be worshipped. They are scum. Like, they're not good people. These are not, and so this is the life of the serial killer. It's sometimes very banal and mundane. Now we're going to a metal show, we're going to a tattoo, we're going to get a piercing. But now you remember, we have people tied up in our basement. So that's what it is, right? And it's so disgusting, and it's so fascinating to me. So yeah, you're right. It's kind of like this commentary on serial killers and that kind of aspect of it. So why don't we talk more about that? And I think, Tori, you kind of brought it up first.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really struck me as I was watching these, and I like grew up in New England, but I live in Pennsylvania, so it was also interesting just like how close a lot of this is.
Yeah.
But one thing I was thinking about, especially in the first entry, was how much these people just felt like people I went to high school with. Like, these would have been like people that were in my friend group, the way they talk, the way they like treat other people. And we just assumed that was like normal behavior. Like, that's how like, teenage, like 20-something-year-olds dudes act. But who knows how many of those people could have also had these things going on. So it was interesting, like how mundane, but also just how, I don't know, how like easy it is to look at these people and be like, yeah, that really could be anyone, like any number of people that I know, which I think was a really interesting aspect of that. And then, finally, because I think part of what I wish there was more of in these is just a little bit more of a story, because that's like a thing I really grasp onto. But that's also why I really like the trajectory of the 3 movies, especially when you get to the end and you really start to see what it looks like when these people start to break down, because what they're doing is clearly not sustainable.
Agreed. I always say that you can't separate these movies. They really should be viewed as a whole, because there is an arc, there is a story to be told underneath and throughout these 3 movies for these characters. Grain, thoughts?
I think it's really interesting that he had these thoughts back in, like, 2000, early 2000s, but it's something that's really relevant now, especially with the recent spate of like Hollywood hunks and heartthrobs playing serial killers. So we've got Zac Efron playing Ted Bundy, Evan Peters playing Dahmer. I mean, like, who's going to be playing John Wayne Gacy, Timothy Chalamet? Like, where are we going here? And I think that it's just, these depictions are very sanitized, and they're very Hollywood, and look what these people were doing, but we're not going to show you everything. We're going to show you something that's easily digestible, whereas Fred Vogel is showing you exactly what it's like. It's disgusting. There's vomit, there's feces, there's several bodily functions. Like, that is what these people do, and that's what makes them so fucked up. And it's like, a lot of the time with like Hollywood dramatizations, it's like they almost present them as not human monsters, almost supernatural, whereas with August Underground, it's like, no, these are sick, sadistic people. They have all the same bodily functions, they deal with all of this, and this is the gritty real life of it.
Yeah, exactly. Lydia, thoughts?
It's so true that you need to watch them all to really get the story. But even like on its surface level, you're going from like the poop covered chair, let's say, as a small, not spoilery thing that I don't want to get into details, because I mean, we don't want to get booted off YouTube, right? To the very end scenes, which are, a lot of poop and vomit and blood everywhere. It's really depraved. But then it gets lost in translation, because if you're a gorehound watching it for gorehound reason, you get caught up in these fantastic effects, which is really what drives all of that home, is that all this looks real. You're not looking at this feces and thinking, oh, I know that that's pudding. Like, it looks pretty real, let alone all of the actual effects and the things that these depraved killers are doing, i.e. killing. And we may not be watching them as people at all, or for their personalities, because we're caught up in the spectacle of it all. And like, the killers themselves don't become much different than these nameless carcasses that they're surrounded by. And so when we look past all of that gore, if we can, and the squealing laughter, because there are things about their personalities that are abrasive and as off-putting as the things we're seeing visually, and the animal feedings, the things that they delight in, are as off-putting as the gore we're seeing. And the lack of regard for humans, be it themselves, their loved ones, or the people on the floor, then we have to, like, it's really hard to tease out the personalities of these people, like specifically Peter, the character, and Krusty, who they have quite fantastic personalities. We have to really work hard to get to know. And do you want to? No. And therein lies like some of what keeps us fascinated by serial killers, like their personalities, their crimes and their personalities. And we're always trying to like explain the depravity through that, while not wanting to discard the victims and wanting to honor the victims. We can't look away from those personalities, because like the current news, the serial killer in the current news is someone who we want to understand the personality to protect ourselves, or to help honor the victims and understand how they became in the situation that they did. So reluctantly, we want to know these personalities and the reasoning behind all this. And this movie really captures even that kind of subtle bit about our fascination with serial killers, and pulls it off so well, if you can handle it. And it sounds so edgelordy to be like, if you can handle it, but really, quite honestly, it's one of the few films, that if you can, I wouldn't want to tell someone they need to either, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Any follow-up to that, Tori or Ukraine? Very good. So next question is, so if you would consider the August Underground trilogy as an extreme horror essential, why would you consider them that? Like, why do you think that? Or if you don't think it's essential, let me know why. I'll start with you, Ukraine. Essential?
To a certain degree, I don't think we should gatekeep any form of horror. So, you know, it doesn't matter if you want to see or have not seen a certain horror film, your fandom is still valid. However, I think because of its infamy, there's always going to be that nagging feeling of, well, if I'm exploring extreme horror, is this something I have to explore? And I guess in some way, it's essential because of the questions it poses to our society. I know before I was like, you know, it's perfectly valid if it doesn't have subtext. But at the same time, it does pose a lot of questions like, is it holding a mirror to our society in the way that through this handheld camera setup, is the audience complicit? You know, is the audience complicit by watching it, or are we complicit in another way by turning away, by not watching it and kind of denying the existence of this type of violence? So yeah, I mean, not to gatekeep, on a certain level, I do think it may be essential.
Excellent. Tori.
Yeah, I think if this is the rabbit hole of horror you want to go down, then this is one you probably will maybe want to, or feel that nagging feeling that you need to watch at some point. I certainly feel as I get more into horror and different kind of like subversive genres that there's much more that I am trying to watch. Like I went on a big rape revenge rabbit hole a few years ago because it used to be something that I could not touch. And then I was like, you know what? I want to understand these movies a little bit more and see like if there is some good I can get from them. And there is. And I think there is, like, you know, we're having a panel on this. So clearly there is value in talking about these movies. And I think for me, just the effects are so interesting and great. And it's so cool that he was a person that taught at the Savini School. Learning that made me so excited. And especially like loving newer things like Terrifier 2. And it took me a while to get there. It was maybe the second movie where I was finally like, oh, I can like appreciate how weird and messed up this particular practical effect is. And now I want to know more about it. And so when I finally got there, that was an exciting part for me. But also just like how much of a low budget movie this is and how much they were able to pull off and make look real and effective. And I think that's amazing, especially as things get, you know, crazier and crazier with the film industry, like people making like low budget movies, like with whatever they can, like, hell yeah, go do it. Go make some weird, crazy stuff.
Oh yeah, the DIY punk rock filmmaking aspect of the August Underground trilogy, I appreciate so much as such a big champion of like underground cinema, very like low budget, independently made film. So I love that about it too. Like this is, I find it so charming. Lydia, extreme horror essential?
Yes and no. They're essentials for extreme horror fans only. And like on one hand, I agree. I don't want to gatekeep either. But like for a general horror fan who likes bleak films and is intrigued, it's maybe not the best thing to go jumping in the deep end with, because they are intermediate extreme horror fan films in a way, because they are like quite brutal. And that's why we can't say, well, can we say we like them? Should we recommend them? We don't really toss those around lightly when we're talking about extreme horror films, really. I was on a panel last year here talking about some films where we said the same sorts of things, and they're not quite as brutal as this. So intermediate, essentials if you are already going down that rabbit hole, definitely.
Thank you. This series is in my top 10, like not best of, but like must watch. Like if you're right. If you're going to go to this place, you want to go to this genre. All right. It's kind of like your starting points, right? When you get people start delving into regular kind of conventional horror, there's like the classics and the stuff. They're like, okay, let's watch The Exorcist and Psycho and, you know, Nosferatu. There's like that list of movies that are like, oh, well, if you're getting into it, here's a great starting point. But I like your point, Lydia, where you're like, starting point, it's like a little bit more kind of precarious, right? You're like, are you going to start down here? Again, that iceberg is really annoying, but it's kind of like a great kind of gauge of, we're going to go deeper down. Like, you don't jump in. Like, you can watch something like a guinea pig movie, but you might have a hard time with an August Underground movie. So it is kind of different. But yeah, thank you so much for your insight. Okay. One of the last questions before we get into our audience questions, because I can see a bunch are lining up, which is fantastic. What's your favorite entry in the series and why, if you have one? Grain, let me pop that back to you to start.
To say favorite, like knife to my nipple, I think I would choose probably Penance, but less like, oh, I really enjoyed this, and more like, I think it had something really interesting to say, like Tori touched on earlier, about just the I can't even speak. I've had way too much Monster today. Just about the breakdown of someone's mind who does this kind of thing, that they're not completely desensitized themselves. And I guess August Underground, the trilogy itself, is an exercise in desensitization for A, its audience, and B, its characters. And just to see the character of Krusty slowly degrade, you know, how much more can she take? And I think it's a really interesting depiction of human psychology, that not everyone is completely immune to trauma, to violence, even if they are the ones that are kind of in the middle of it, kind of carrying it out. And I guess it represents as well, like I said, the audience and how desensitized we can become to A, fictionalized violence, but B, also real life violence. You know, since the dawn of the millennium, the internet has advanced, technology has advanced, we are being subjugated to violence every single day, whether we want to or not. It's there on Twitter, on the news, etc. So it really represents like how we are as a society now, and how much more desensitized we will become to crime and to violence, etc.
Thank you. Lydia, favorite?
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
I do have a favorite, and I really like the whole thing together in a way. But yes, it is like an exercise in desensitization. And that first thing that he was trying to say with August Underground, the first film, is, and he would even admit, I've heard in interviews, that it's kind of muddled, that statement he was trying to make. And then Mordum seems to be everyone's fan favorite. These are signed copies of my husband, so I've got to show and tell. And it works as that saggy middle of any 3-act story. But then you come to Penance, which is my favorite, my absolute favorite, because it is so dark. Even the cover's dark. You can't really see what's going on. Yeah. And that's for the best because of YouTube. But it is so dark. It's so well shot. The characters are so much more vivid, so much more real. And that has the scene where he has said in The Sandman, he mentions, if the filmmakers want to show you a piece of poop for 2 minutes, that's what you're going to watch, and you're going to like it because that's what their day is. And it really drives all of that uncut, these are going to be the tapes found as evidence when they get caught kind of thing, that drives all of that home. And it has the scene that made me look away. And it's not the scenes that you might expect, because I'm me. It is the most sick and unwatchable thing, in my opinion, which is ketchup. And ketchup is disgusting to me. And they spray it on the ground, and then Krusty eats some off of the asphalt. And I couldn't watch, really. Like, I'm not sure if she eats it, because I don't know. I was looking away and gagging. So that kind of helps bring it to that other echelon for me.
I get it. My favorite is Mordum. Penance is like, that is bleak. That has less rewatchability to me, because that's when I feel like shit gets real and real bleak, real dark, real bad. Mordum is my favorite. It's just like, it was a really great middle of the story. Maggot's in it, and I've come to know Michael Todd Schneider, so my favorite Maggot is him, and it's just a really wonderful performance by everyone, and it's really wild. Yeah, so Mordum's my favorite. Okay, so let's get into our audience questions, because we know we have some, and Jess has popped in a bunch of questions for herself, which I'm really excited about. Thank you, Jess, our tech gremlin behind the scenes. All right, so folks, if you have questions, let's pop them into the chat now. But Jess, let's throw up one. All right. So from Kathleen, and I know exactly what she's talking about. She says, I saw Fred Vogel interviewed and he talked about prop hammers he sold. One man bought a hammer and assaulted his girlfriend with it. To be honest, I am more interested in the stories in the stories on these films than the films themselves. I'm assuming that's kind of what you mean. I mean, that's definitely a valid opinion. If you watch the Beyond Horror documentary, which is a newer documentary that was out a couple of years ago, more of like a Kickstarter, like Indiegogo type campaign, but it's now been actually released and distributed by Putrid Film Productions, which is Jonathan Doe's production company. He goes into more detail of what happened. Like, that doesn't really give a lot of context. I don't know if you folks know what Kathleen is referring to, but Fred Vogel does sign like autograph hammers for fans, and they just use them as props. And it's like, oh, I've got a hammer signed by Fred Vogel. Fred Vogel played Peter in it, and that's his favorite weapon of choice is the hammer. So it ended up happening. It was a fan who bought the hammer, who unfortunately there was a mix-up with his medication. Something had happened, and he mentally ill, and there was a mess up, and he did assault his girlfriend. She was fine. In the end, everything was kind of forgiven, but that is kind of the reality of being a filmmaker in this kind of extreme underground world, is that stuff like that can happen. And I mean, I'm curious about it too. But anybody have any thoughts on that?
I do.
Yeah.
I've had conversations lately, and it's mostly me instigating them because my husband is probably the more level-headed extreme horror fan in the house, where I'm like, I wonder if any serial killers have watched all these. And it's a morbid thought. It's morbid as hell. But
yeah,
like, if we look at their bookshelves, what are we going to find? We very well could find this. Is that the fault of the filmmaker? Absolutely not. Is it the fault of someone who sold it to them? Absolutely not. My husband did have one of those hammers too. So I wish that we could be the example of the people who, like, built their first bookshelf together as a married couple with the Fred Vogel hammer.
I would also wish you were that couple.
We could have been.
Coulda, shoulda, woulda. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? If you've heard of that story?
I haven't heard of it, but there's always that thing, isn't there? Even with, like, let's say mainstream horror, there's always going to be like, Freddy Krueger made me do weird things with knives, or there's always going to be this thing, is it corrupting our youth? Whereas people fail to remember that Charles Manson said that the Beatles spoke to him, so you're going to get it, whatever. It doesn't matter what genre of, whether it's music, movies, you're going to get that sort of connection with true crime or people's stabilities or mental health situations. So, I mean, if anyone says that to me, I'm very much like, meh.
Yeah. All right. Next question here from Jessica. Thank you. Does the reputation of these films succeed the films themselves? Interesting question. Tori, what do you think?
Yeah, it is interesting. I think honestly, these films have been more interesting to me, like, after watching and reflecting on them, and now having like these conversations and hearing more about them. And so it is interesting because, like, watching it itself is such a crazy experience that was really uncomfortable at times. But then, as a horror fan, you find a lot to appreciate in the series as well, especially when it came to like practical effects and just what they were able to pull off. And especially when we live in a time where it feels like so much studio stuff is like really censored and really sanitized. And so it is really nice to see something that is so not, just to know that that's possible. So yeah, I don't know. It definitely like hit me like the way I expected it to. But it was also interesting just to see how much I could really appreciate, even though I struggled through a lot of parts of this series.
Igraine, what do you think? Because it's, again, your first time watch.
Yeah, I think, you know, it kind of deserves its reputation. A lot of the time with a lot of films, you know, people are like, oh, this is the scariest film ever or the most disturbing film ever. And you watch it and you're kind of like, eh. So yes and no, like it was disturbing. I don't think I had as much of a visceral reaction straight away as I've heard that a lot of people have. But like when I went to bed that night, I usually listened to like either true crime or true horror podcasts, and I was like, I'm going to leave that for today. I think I'll listen to rain sounds. So yeah, it might not have been like the visceral reaction that everyone talks about, but like Tori, it was definitely like an afterthought where I was like, oh, actually, I understand its reputation.
Right. Lydia, what do you think?
Yeah, in a lot of ways it did. And its reputation definitely preceded itself here as far as the Canadian Border Services Authority goes, because they broke 21 obscenity laws just bringing it into the damn country. So it must be rough. But yeah, so like people hearing that sort of thing, does it live up to that? Depends on your opinion, I suppose. But yeah, it's one of the few that really did live up to that reputation. And I had definitely heard about it before I saw it, that's for sure. I would really not like to be the person who saw it before they heard about it.
Ooh, yeah, good point. Good point. Okay, next question here. Is it pretty highly ranked in extreme horror, or does it kind of fall in the middle of all extreme horror films? I'll start with you, Lydia, because you kind of put it, you kind of called it like a middle ground horror series in horror films. So why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, and I'll say hi to TN Comedy Thomas Mickle. He's a friend and fan and big, yeah, friend. Hi, Tom. Yeah, I refer to it as intermediate horror as far as extreme horror goes. And yeah, I'd say maybe it's not the top most depraved thing. There's probably worse things out there, and maybe I've seen things that tie it for the top 5 of like probably like the top or the bottom of that iceberg. But then there are worse things in the news, right? And watching, I would definitely recommend, if someone is intrigued by this and doesn't want to jump in, and maybe shouldn't if you're listening to me, watch the movie Sandman, S-A-N, like S&MAN. And it's a faux documentary or a real documentary if you want to live vicariously through me, who like gets confused sometimes as to whether it's real. It's not, but yeah, I wish I was confused. Watch Sandman, because they talk to Fred Vogel and they talk about these films. You see a lot of clips from them, the more tame clips from Mordum mostly, and they talk a lot about where this falls and what is more rough. So I'd really recommend that. So I'd say not in the middle, somewhere near the top. Yeah.
Middle top. Or I guess like middle bottom. Wherever we're going.
Like, iceberg. Yeah. Middle bottom.
That's great. Anybody have any other do you have any thoughts on that, Ukraine?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Lydia that it's not like the most high ranked extreme horror, because that's when you're getting into kind of a suspiciously illegal territory. But it is definitely that almost that tier that you're like, okay, I kind of know my boundaries. I don't want to, you know, possibly be put on a list somewhere. So this is where I'm going to go. This is the middle. It's not the nice middle, but it's, you know, it's the middle of something before you get into that real dodgy territory.
Yeah. Tori, how about you?
I think that's a good distinction too, because I was like, yeah, if there's worse than this, what can it possibly be? And dodgy sounds about right, because I definitely don't want to see any like real violence enacted against other people. I think it definitely, because I was not a horror fan like my whole life. It wasn't until a little later on, like my 20s, that I really became a horror fan. So and part of that is that distinction of really knowing that what I am watching is fake, and I can really appreciate the practical effects. And once I can really get into that mindset, then I'm like, great, I can handle this. But yeah, this, you know, you can definitely watch it, and there's a lot that might be really troubling, but it doesn't get into that like dodgy, problematic territory.
No, that's when you get into like they're not films anymore. Like some of it's fetish work or it's pornography. So it's not really a film in the sense that it's a movie where there's like a narrative and stuff like that. I mean, I myself like a lot of like fetish gore and stuff. And there's sometimes a narrative, sometimes it's very loose, but it's still a movie or it's a short. Like it's an actual film. It's not just pornography. That's kind of when we talk about the iceberg, I might as well just keep bringing it up. It's fine, but it's a good as like a reference range or like a visual aid on, because when you get lower to that, that's no longer film. Like they're not movies anymore. It's pornography. It's illegal. It's bad stuff. It's actual real gore. It's real bad stuff, like actual dead babies and cats and, anyways. But speaking of like the realm of actual cinema and film and narrative and filmmaking and practical effects, I would say it definitely is a high ranking / low ranking series for everything that you folks have just said of characters and taboos that are broken. Like it's really, there's a lot. I mean, Mordum runs into incest. There's dead babies. Like there's a lot of things that they traverse through in this series of movies. So thank you very much for that. And then I think we have a next question. Thank you, Jessica, again. She's saying, do you think a series like August Underground could be done today? Lydia, let me jump over to you.
No, I don't think so. And not the way that it is and not about the things it's about. I mean, you could shoot some grainy stuff of me using a plastic straw, and that's going to make a lot of people angry. Not in the way that August Underground did or will continue to. I don't think someone could do this without it being derivative. And I don't think someone could do this and touch on the same things without being labeled as insensitive, where at the time, these were things that needed to be talked about. These are things now that are in the movie talking about, like even the incest, some of the child stuff, some of the just the way that they treat one another, butt stuff, things like that, where things that people needed to talk about and needed to be portrayed in film, I think, where I don't think it needs to be anymore. And now it may be seen as gratuitous. So I don't think that it could be done. And it wouldn't be dangerous filmmaking. And it wouldn't be such hard work of filmmaking and getting it out there. There would be a very different palette for it now, I think.
Ukraine, what do you think?
Lydia brought up some really good points. I think if it was to be made today, obviously it wouldn't have that VHS kind of Blair Witch influenced vibe. I think it would be someone would do it using technology such as like streaming live, which would make for it to be interesting, but I think it would be quite a dangerous practice of filmmaking for the filmmakers themselves. I'm sure a lot of people would stumble onto it and be like, dear God, what is being streamed live? Call the police, which, might be an interesting experimentation in guerrilla style filmmaking. But yeah, I don't know. I think it could be made, but like Lydia said, I don't think it would have the same intentions or the same effectiveness.
Tori.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely all of the points you all made, I think, are really important, because I would wonder about the intention of making something like that now. And also because I think any of like the newer extreme horror I've seen is so much more stylized that it does kind of lose the effect. Even though weirdly the graininess helped me like palette some of what was going on a little bit more. Cause I was like, I'm happy I can't see this like pile of like whatever more clearly. But it would be interesting, like, if there is some like, big backlash that comes with everything that's happening with like the writers and actors strike and just like the state of movies in and of itself, seeing something that tries to pull off something similar as some sort of political statement or social statement that isn't trying to be derivative. I think it could be interesting. I don't know what that would look like or what that would be, but I think it would need to have a different intention for sure.
Excellent, excellent point. So, folks that are watching, if you have any burning questions, please get them in now, or else I'm going to just start wrapping up. I don't know why that sounded like a threat, but this has been amazing. So, yeah, if there's any other questions out there, folks, please pop them in now. As we start to wrap up, any final thoughts on the August Underground trilogy? Again, a couple of first-time watches. So, are these going to stick with you? Have I given you nightmares? Thank you for being such troopers.
I think I had, like, you know, when people talk about feeling really calm after watching like horror movies and why, like, you know, as someone that has anxiety, that's a reason I love horror. I had like a crazy feeling of just like, oh, wow, that was a lot. And now I can just like relax and vibe. So I weirdly had like the most relaxing rest of the night. Although it was also terrifying being alone in my house a little bit after watching that night.
That's right. Are you, is it safe to assume that you're glad that you did, you know, give yourself that opportunity to watch them?
Yeah, I think so, especially as I delve more into extreme horror and definitely want more recommendations on things. Like I have started watching some of the guinea pig movies and find those really interesting, especially since I love body horror. If it has really like interesting, like thematic, like philosophical kind of questions with this violence, like that's like really my thing. So I'm glad I watched it, and I think it's going to make it easier to watch a lot of other extreme horror.
In some ways, yes. I always find it interesting because everybody has like their own kind of threshold or like thing that really like disturbs them or like unsettles them. Like I still have yet to rewatch Snowtown because it is one that unsettled me and shook me so much. But then again, when I think about it, it was probably like 5 to 6 years ago when I watched it, and I have watched a lot of movies since then, so I might be able to rewatch it and be totally fine. I don't know what that says about me. It's fine. It's fine, whatever it says. But we do have a Tom jumped in with one last question for you folks. So, or a comment at least. Cronenberg might be able to pull something off like this. What directors would you like to see try to make a sequel or remake of this movie? Oh, these are words I don't like in extreme cinema. Sequel and remake. But any thoughts here? Maybe Lydia.
I want to see a sequel to this quite badly.
Where are they now?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. They are in jail. I will tell you. I wrote it in my mind. Fred Vogel, give me a call. We'll discuss. I really want to see the aftermath of this. Like, and you could say that there isn't an aftermath because of the end. I'm not going to spoil anything, but it could have just ended. But I would like to see, because these are sloppy killers. They're sloppy, horrible people. They're not very bright. I kept making fun of juggalos and like thinking maybe they would go to the gathering because they end up going to like rock shows in between everyone. And they're just sloppy. They're sloppy. Their DNA is literally everywhere. Yeah. So I would like to see Fred Vogel do this. I don't know if anyone else could really ever do it real justice, and to see it in the style of anybody else. I don't know if I could stomach that. Right? It sounds kind of weird, like talking about this movie where there's a lot of things people can't stomach, but I don't know if I'd ever want to see this particular franchise or these particular characters in anyone else's hands.
I agree with you very strongly on that. Absolutely. Anybody has any other final thoughts that you want to grain final thoughts in the August Underground trilogy as we wrap up?
No, I mean, I'm glad I got to watch it. I feel like it's like almost like a Scout Girls badge of honor that I've done it. I am usually the kind of person that likes to ruin people's days, but I I don't think I'll be recommending this to my group of friends. But yeah, glad I watched it.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for joining me today on the Extreme Essentials, the August Underground Trilogy panel. You are excellent. I adore you. You inspire all of us all the time. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you to Jess, my tech gremlin behind the scenes, doing an excellent job as she always does. She loves hearing all these discussions, even on movies she may never watch. But love you, Jess. Thank you. So folks, that's it for the panels today. I hope to see you all back here tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for the next panel, which is on New French Extremity. But until then, stay grim. Bye.